Dale Little here in Chisinau, Romania, and we're wanting to get back into our study of Daniel and looking at Daniel chapter 11, verse 21. We're going to pick up with now. Antiochus III, we last talked about he and his immediate descendants. Now, eventually Antiochus IV, and that's what we're going to look at. We'll pick up with here in verse 21. Succeeded, but not directly, Antiochus III. There's a couple in line before Antiochus IV was supposed to take the throne. And so at first Antiochus III took the throne, succeeded his father there, and that was Seleucus IV Philopater. And in 187 BC, he decided to send his treasure to plunder the Jewish temple in order to pay Rome. Antiochus III, just not too long before that, had died from going to plunder a temple, another kind of temple in the far eastern part of the kingdom or the dynasty there, empire of the Seleucids. And he was killed doing that. And so here his son, Seleucus IV Philopater, the immediate successor, sent his treasure to plunder the Jewish temple in order to pay Rome. And soon after that, Seleucus IV died, possibly by poisoning. It seems to be a very common thing during that time. So we'll pick up there, and what happened was, as we'll get into that, it says in verse 21, "And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries." Now, this is Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a forerunner of the Antichrist. He makes his way in, even though he wasn't the next in line still. He was able to bribe, and that word flattery is the best I can find out in studying the Greek and looking at some commentaries. Basically means that he bribed some people too. Here Daniel is introduced to two future kings, and starting with verse 21 here. Throughout the rest of the chapter, now a lot of people see it a little different than this, but here Daniel is introduced to two future kings who almost appear to be one and are described through the remainder of this chapter and even into chapter 12. The first has already been, but the other is still yet future. I'm not sure that Daniel understood that these are two different kings who lived centuries apart. I tend to think probably not. Although it is easy to read verses 21 through the remainder of the chapter and wonder which is referring to Antichrist to come, and which is referring to this Antiochus Epiphanes, who has already been. Most scholars see Antiochus through verse 35 and the remainder to the coming Antichrist. I'm not sure I see it quite that clearly. But we'll go, as we go on, Antiochus IV Epiphanes was the Seleucid king of the north, born in 215 BC, around 400 years after the time of Daniel's prophecy. He is unique in that he is also a picture of the coming Antichrist spoken of by Jesus in Matthew 24 and in the book of Revelation. This is the little horn spoken of in Daniel chapter 8 also. He began his reign in 175 BC and gave himself the title Epiphanes, which means manifest God. But some refer to him as Antiochus Epiphanes, the madman. Very similar play on words there in the original language. And instead of calling him the God manifest, it was the madman. He had bribed people in order to seize the throne and made promises and deals, and that's much the way we understand the Antichrist will come on the scene. Rome had defeated his father Antiochus III in 191 at Thermopylae, and 189 BC at Magnesia. Antiochus III was allowed to continue to rule, but Rome assured his allegiance by holding his son Antiochus IV Epiphanes as a hostage in Rome, possibly after he was unable to produce Hannibal to them. Hannibal had been serving in Antiochus III's navy, and they were both defeated, and I think we covered that. We covered that in the last episode. And so Antiochus III was defeated on the land. Hannibal's naval force was defeated by the Romans. And of course, Hannibal had never had naval experience before. He'd been of course, magnificent general, brilliant. And there seemed to be a little bit in feelings there between he and Antiochus III. Here is the greatest general, one of the greatest generals that ever lived, Hannibal. And Antiochus seemed to think he didn't want his advice, military advice, so he wanted to run things himself. So he put Hannibal in charge of his navy. We see that Antiochus was held as hostage in Rome, possibly after his father was unable to produce Hannibal to them. And his brother, King Seleucus IV, who we mentioned just earlier, exchanged him for Demetrius, Seleucus' own son. So he traded his son as a hostage for his brother. And after Seleucus was murdered by Heliodorus, a usurper, Antiochus in turn ousted him by bribery and convinced Rome that he was the protector for the young Demetrius, who was the rightful heir, thus seizing the throne for himself. And all was not lost for Demetrius, though. However, he later, after the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Ptolemy VI had his agents in Rome to assist in Demetrius' escape. And Demetrius then took his rightful place by ousting the underage Antiochus V, who took the kingdom after his father there. So much intrigue going on, and that's the way it will be, and even more so with the Antichrist when he comes on the scene. Who knows, maybe in the very near future. And with the arms of flood, and this verse 22 and 23, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with small people. Now after the death of Antiochus III the Great, the counselors of the young Ptolemy VI of Egypt thought it may be a good time to regain territory. Egypt had lost to Antiochus III. So Ptolemy VI was Antiochus IV's nephew, Antiochus Epiphanes' nephew, son of his sister Cleopatra I. However, Antiochus IV Epiphanes defeated Ptolemy VI, the prince of the covenant, is who that would be described there, and the covenant that had been made. This is not mentioning and talking about the covenant of the Jewish people, but it's between the covenant that they had made, referring back to agreements that had been reached in the covenant that had been made between the two nations there, two empires. And so he imprisoned Ptolemy VI in Syria. In other words, Antiochus Epiphanes imprisoned his nephew in Syria. Soon after, Ptolemy VI's brothers, Ptolemy VIII, seized the throne of Egypt and the Ptolemy dynasty, and Ptolemy VI made a deal with Antiochus Epiphanes to help him regain his throne. So much back and forth here that went on in this such intriguing time After Ptolemy VI regained his throne with the help of Antiochus Epiphanes, he and his brother Ptolemy VIII that sometime joined forces together again, and they drove Antiochus out of Pelusium, the same place Cambyses II in 525 BC had defeated Egypt, and where in 343 BC Artaxerxes III defeated the Egyptians. And so we'll go to verse 24 then. He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province. And he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. So here Antiochus Epiphanes, he's still trying to take Egypt, to retaliate against them for their attacks, and being driven out by his two nephews. And so he retaliates against most of Egypt. He took basically the entire country, as I understand it, except possibly Alexandria. That was about the only city left under the Ptolemy dynasty's control. The Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes had taken the rest of the nation and the empire, and had carried off many wealth of, almost all of Egypt's wealth with it. Antiochus retaliated and took most of Egypt, plundering its riches, and allowed his soldiers to share in the spoils. That's, as it says there, he shall talk about what his fathers had not done. He shall scatter among them the prey, the spoil, and the riches, yea, and it shall forecast his devices. But the spoil he shared, evidently, with the riches that he took. Now, I'm sure not some of the most rich things, but he had allowed his soldiers much more as they took things and plundered, and as a reward for their service. And that wasn't always that unusual. It was done, and I think it became more done. The Roman army, I think, did that with their soldiers, and began to allow them to keep the plunder that they took as they fought these different peoples. And so it seems like Antiochus went even beyond that some. And he did, because it says not only of the riches, but notice it also says the prey. And so they were allowed to do what they wanted with the people that they conquered. Whether to use them, sell them into slavery, use them as slaves or whatever. And so we see then at the end of that, verse 24, it says, he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. In other words, his time is limited. At the appointed time is basically what that is saying. Then it will cease. Now, verse 25 through 27, we see, and he shall stir up, they're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both of these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table. But it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Again, to see that similar phrase that we saw just a few verses back. We just read 24. And many think that verse 24 rather, is more of a encapsulated form of verses 25 through 27 here. They're describing the same event, same happenings, but it's verse 24 is kind of gives a a brief, like I say, encapsulated form of what happened, and then it follows with 25, 26, 27 then, and goes back and gives a more detailed account of the same event. That's the way most people, and I don't see any reason to see that differently. It's no other really valid explanation for it or understanding that I know of. And so we see that the king of the south would not, says will not stand. The king of the north coming against Ptolemy VI, that is. And Ptolemy VI co-ruled with his mother, Cleopatra I, until her death in 170 BC. On her deathbed, Cleopatra appointed Eulaeus and Linnaeus, and that would be referring to they that feed of the portion of his meat. In other words, they would eat at the same table basically as the king. They became Ptolemy's advisors and were pushing him to make war with Antiochus and shall destroy him. Is not speaking of physically destroying him, but militarily as a ruler, because Ptolemy ended up, he married his sister Cleopatra II and began to recover later on and ruled again. This was not the end of his time here, even though it was for a while. Verse 27 seems to speak of the conspiracy of Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy VI to help Ptolemy to get his throne back from his brother. They did succeed, but it did not prosper, either one, that greatly because of Rome's growing influence. There's no way to escape. Rome's is really becoming now the major power, world power at that time. And so up until this time, it had been a battle between different powers. We know Carthage was in there, and then you had Greece, and they had the Seleucid Empire, and they were all vying for supremacy. And Rome was the one that seemed to be, and certainly did, went out in the end. And slowly they took care of Carthage. They finally defeated Hannibal. Went and let him rule in the city for a while, and he tried to clean up some of the corruption, and so the Romans were told that he was trying to plan an insurrection. And learning they were coming to talk to him, he figured he better leave town, and so he ended up in the court of Antiochus III the Great, Antiochus Epiphanes' father. Then he was defeated there in that navy battle we just talked about, and from there lived to fight at least one more naval battle, which he ended up winning that time. But here's notice, and let me back up just a little bit to talk to. I think when we started off back there, I meant to point out that it talks the angel. This is the angel talking to Daniel, revealing these things. In verse 21, when we first started here, it says, "In his estate shall stand up a vile person." Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a wicked, vile person. I even saw, I didn't read the article, I saw a headline somewhere on the internet just not too long ago that said something about that Antiochus Epiphanes wasn't really he wasn't as bad as he's made out to be. He's worse than he's made out to be. When you have an angel that says he's a vile person, then he's a vile person. And you learn about some of the things that he did there. So what happened was that it talks about they that feed of the portion of his meat about the king of the south there, Ptolemy VI. And as I said, after Cleopatra first passed away, and she signed these two to help the young king and advise him there. And so they pushed him to make war with Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's how they kind of destroyed him for a time. But like I said, that destruction was not literal, it wasn't physical. So then verse 28 says, "Then shall he return into his own land with great riches." Let me back up, because here's that same phrase I want to talk about. It says, "But the end is not yet. For it will be an appointed time, and in that time Antiochus continued his growing wickedness." Verse 28, "Then it said, shall he return to his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land." In an effort to continue to Hellenize his empire, to turn it more into the Greek culture, Antiochus replaced the Jewish high priest, basically putting it up for sale with one who was not of the things of Aaron. He's not a descendant of Aaron. And so your priesthood from there on was pretty much corrupted and lost on into the Roman times. But he put it up for sale, and a rebellion ensued while he was in Egypt. After he'd got his spoils and won that victory, and he came back through, a rebellion ensued while he was there, and on his way to return to Syria, he brutally quelled the uprising in Jerusalem in 170 BC. In an effort to do away with the Jewish religion, Antiochus had built a gymnasium where Greek sports competitions were held near the temple. These sporting events required nude participation, and even those going into the gymnasium had to be nude. Knowing this violated Jewish law, all Jews were required to attend at least one event. That's what Antiochus Epiphanes made them do. He's trying to break down their Jewish religion there, and their strict laws that they went by in following God and that God had laid down for them. And to this day, we see that same thing. People just chafe at Christianity because we dare, I think, live a clean life, and so they. You got Hollywood, you got TV, you got all these forces pushing for all kind of just licentiousness. The movies that are put out are just continually about sex and more sex, and so there is a movement. There's been debate about that, but there's a definite movement. The world hates people that are just and are righteous, and that don't run to the same excess that they do, and the same debauchery. And so they will force the issue. They've done it down through history. And so here, Antiochus forced the Jewish people to participate in these things, and many of the Jewish people gave over to that, and that lifestyle. They became basically what you'd call Hellenist, and so you had a split nation at that time, Jewish nation, under control of Antiochus and the Seleucid Empire. It's much like today. We've got the conservatives and the progressives, and so you've had the same thing back then, and most of history you have similar things. The world is always going to be pushing against the things of God, always. So let me read just a couple more verses here. Well, no, that hadn't got through here where I'm at yet. We see the rebellion had ensued in Egypt. And so he had built a gymnasium, and so as he came back through, the Jewish people were still rebelling against what he's trying to do here. And some think that Antiochus ransacked and looted the temple at this time. I think there is a good evidence that happened a couple of years later when it was even more brutal in putting down another Jewish rebellion. First and Second Maccabees are historical records, but they're not the inspired Word of God. That's the reason you don't find them in your Bibles, at least the Protestant Bible. And so we'll see that as he came back, they were rebelling against these things, like being required to go to the gymnasium at least one time, in the nude, and watching the nude events, sporting events go on. And so some think he ransacked the temple, but I don't think he did, because at this time, because it's recorded, and there's a discrepancy a little bit, I guess you'd say, between First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. And both of them talk about him looting the temple of all its treasure. Well, if he already looted them at this time, then he couldn't loot them again, everything the second time, since he'd already taken it and cleaned it out. Of course, some of the stuff could have been replaced, but nothing like, what was there before. They didn't have the means. They were paying too much tribute to Antiochus. And Antiochus had to pay his tribute to Rome. And so just wasn't enough to go around. I think what happened was the two accounts on both returns from Egypt, but later on Antiochus suffers a bit of a defeat as he goes to Egypt, and he returns even more angry and enraged. And I think that is the time that this really took place. I think that just some of the ancient history, it's hard to separate some things sometimes, and different people report different things, and so you got First Maccabees and Second Maccabees that kind of give the same account, but in different time periods. And Antiochus did come back through from Egypt twice, at least. The first time after a great victory, and he came back through, and so he was feeling good then. I'm sure he had great treasures, as it said, taken back with him. And even though he saw the revolt, yes, he put it down brutally. He still had his great treasures. They bring him back from Egypt, and things were looking good. I don't think that's when he really took out his wrath on the nation. And I think that will come up in the following verses. Then there are also the number of Jews he killed that talks about. That's that's been attributed to the first revolt and that he put down, and then again at the second revolt, the same figure. So I think a lot of it's two incidents, but a lot of the information is meshed together into two of them. Now, we see we'll pick up next time, and we'll close with this, is the race to control Egypt. You got Rome, and you got the Seleucid kingdom now. Whoever controls Egypt may have the upper hand. If the Seleucids had been able to take Egypt and got Alexandria and took the whole, done away with the Ptolemy dynasty and had taken control, they would have been in much better position to maybe withstand Rome. And Rome's conquest in that area may have ceased at that time. But we'll see as things go on. Of course, history, we all know that Rome did end up becoming the great empire. And so they ended up just in the nick of time. It was a race till he see who was going to get to control Egypt. So we'll pick up there in verse 29 in the next session, del Little Chesnadilla, Romania.